What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Outlier podcast. I am here with Nick. It does say, I think it's Alyssa down there. I'm assuming that is else of sorts. Even though you look beautiful, but I
Thank
wouldn't
you.
peg you for an Alyssa. But welcome to the podcast, man. Great to meet you.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have my main setup for like all my computers and screens. I have no camera. So, and then I have a laptop, but I used to do quant stuff on it and it literally blew up. So now I have to use my wife's stuff.
Fair enough. And then, at the end of the day, if you blow up her stuff, it's not yours, right? It's just, then it's like, all right.
Yeah, great. I mean, I paid for it, so I guess I guess it wouldn't be that great. I have to buy a new one.
Yeah. Well, like I was telling you right before we started recording, and then for anybody watching, I don't right now it looks like a little choppy for both of us, but I'm recording it to the cloud, so I think it'll come through okay. The audio sounds great. So if it looks a little choppy, don't sweat it. It's on our end, not ours, or not yours, but it should be legible and you should be able to hear us anyways. As I was telling him right before we start, like I said, you look great. I don't. So it's not like people watch this to look at me. So I never really think that's a problem, anyways. But like I was saying right before we started, I was introduced to you by a longtime viewer of my channel who I really respect his opinion of people, markets, those kinds of things, because he takes a very scientific and programmatic approach to things. And as you were talking about the quant stuff, it obviously immediately made sense to me why he's been keeping his eye on you. So I was asking
Yeah.
for recommendations for podcast guests, and he threw you up. In my Discord, he's known as Dad Bod Jelly Belly, which
Mhm.
you always got to love like a good Discord, or it reminds me of like on Xbox, there's like the random screen names and stuff. It's always the craziest shit. It's always like Dad Bod Jelly Belly, but that's
Yeah.
what he goes by. So
There you go.
he recommended you, and I was super stoked. I had a chance to look up some of your background and whatnot, and obviously the fact that you started in, well, I don't know if you started in the UFC. Obviously, you had a little bit of stuff preceding that. I think you actually had a very non-traditional approach in that, if I'm not mistaken, at 13, you had dropped out of school, and
Yep.
then you started going down, obviously, a very different route than a lot of standard people go down. So I'm looking forward to dive into that, but you have a very non-linear pattern, which is actually very linear for traders. All of
Okay.
us come from these crazy ass backgrounds. Some of us very, very make sense, and a bunch of us were just literally a band of misfits. So you had your early experience, went to the UFC, you were wheeling and dealing out there, you fought people. I think you fought Islam Makhachev, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
I think I saw Charles Oliveira, another pretty big name in the sport. Like you were definitely out there doing the thing.
Yeah.
And then in the meantime, you decided that, like some of us, you have a giant nerd inside of you, got fascinated by markets. So we have a lot to cover. Taking us back all the way to the beginning, I want to focus specifically on the point that you dropped out of school, because you mentioned something in another podcast that really stuck with me that I want to linger on for other people, which is the way that that impacts our self-assessment and the way that we think about ourselves and evaluate ourselves. And you've been able to overcome that. So
Yeah.
talk us through that point when 13-year-old you is like, okay, I'm done with this. And then where did you go from there?
Well, what you're saying is not exactly correct. It's actually opposite. So
Okay.
when I was younger, I grew up in a house that was full of not so good people. So
Mm-hmm.
lots of drug use, lots of alcohol use, and my stepfather was a evil person
Okay.
essentially, and he sort of dragged on our family, and he kind of put my mom in a situation to where she wasn't functioning correctly either. And so because of that, like I went to school, but not that often.
I
So
see.
really the first 13 years of my life were I had very little education. So I had almost none. And then
Oh, okay.
eventually what happened is I was taken away from that family, and then I was shipped up to live with my father. And then now I went from the ghetto into like a middle class neighborhood with my father, who's a well adjusted, proper businessman. And so then I had to get it initiated into school with no background really. So did I go to school? I did, but I was abused and my parents didn't care. And so coming up that way, it's like I was thrown in to high school with none of the requirements. You know what I mean? So that's the lack of education part. And then my father put me in school, and then I started to learn everything much faster that way. So that's how that kind of initially started in the life. So it wasn't, so I didn't drop out when I was 13. That's like when I just really first got into it.
Right. Okay. And then
Yeah.
before that's when you went through like the big transition. You dropped out of like your previous cycle and then you moved into this new one.
Yep.
Um, got it. And I mean, one of the things that sticks out to you or sticks out to me about you, it's very similar to what we find in a lot of military people is just adaptability, right? Like that right there
Yeah.
is starting down the path of adaptability. So you get into this better environment, you start learning and you start building kind of your base education. And
Yep.
then what do you do after high school? What's after that?
So I ended up learning the stuff I needed to in high school very fast, but I was a very depressed kid. So I was very tough because I was used to fighting people my whole life. My stepfather, we lived in a very rough neighborhood, so I mean, I fought all the time. So I was a very tough kid, but like deep down, I was very depressed. I was sad. I hated myself. If I looked in the mirror, I didn't see anything I liked because I've just been talked down to my whole life. And so my father decided to initiate me into sports, and he started with wrestling. And
I see.
so he put me into wrestling as sort of like a way to for me to, gain confidence, to get in better shape. Like I wasn't super fat or anything, but I was in terrible shape. I was just in like a very sad kid. And it turned into an obsession of mine essentially because I started to get really good at it. And then I went from being an unknown to being a known. I went from nobody caring about me to a lot of people caring about me. And that's sort of that initiation into like, if I work hard at this skill, people will pay attention to me, people will like me, and it makes me feel better about myself. And so I became a a very good wrestler very quickly. So I started very late, but by the end of my senior year, I was one of the best wrestlers in Minnesota. And then I went to the University of Minnesota, who had the best wrestling in the country at the time. And so that's how I got into college. So I essentially got into college to be a wrestler with the idea of like competing in the Olympics later in my life. That was kind of the initial why I went to college. And then eventually I tried to be a doctor. That I was going to go to school to be a doctor, but when I just college just I just didn't like it. Like I didn't fit in. I had a hard time relating to a lot of people there. The people on the wrestling team, I always was a very good wrestler, but I didn't get along with the actual wrestlers on the wrestling team. And it was the first time in my life that I was really on my own again. So it's like I was on my own when I was young, but then I went and moved with my father. And then when I went back to being on my own, all the this realization of everything I had dealt with as a child started to kick in. So I had trouble sleeping, I had trouble focusing. And then my career in wrestling and my college career started to tank rather quickly because I needed to like deal with that kind of mental baggage that I had never really dealt with.
That's really interesting. So that's actually a part of your story I didn't catch in the other podcast that is really curious to me. So how do you get out of that rut? You go through this rapid learning phase, you start seeing success, you start seeing some of the social recognition of your work. That's part of the fuel. But then you start actually kind of going on this little bit of a decline, which you
Yeah.
wouldn't expect given what we know about the rest of your trajectory, right? Like
Yeah.
bums don't get into the UFC. So something happened somewhere between those 2 points. What was it?
It was just pretty much just my life just fell apart. So essentially, I really crashed. I became very depressed. I became very frustrated with my father, who had taken care of me for allowing me to go through that, even though it wasn't his fault. It was taken away from him. But I got frustrated with him. I got frustrated with my family, and I sort of just went off the rails for about a year. And I had to learn how to deal with it, because really what I did is when I got to my father, I just sort of like pretended that the previous life didn't happen. And so like it sounds ridiculous, but I really didn't think about it for 5 years.
Mhm.
I just never thought about it. I was just like it was like I was released from a prison camp. I was just like, thank God that's over. Now I'm going on to the next phase. But you can forget about something for so long, but it starts to like it's like a shadow behind you. It's always there. And if you don't take care of it, it will start getting into your life. So I started to like really struggle sleeping. I was having lots of nightmares. I started to people would uh maybe someone would be slightly offensive to me, but I would take it overboard, like he was like my stepfather trying to attack me or something, you know? And so then I would go overboard aggressive to them. And it's very hard to have relationships in life when when someone says something small and you blow up, you know? And so essentially my life tanked very badly. And about I ended up having to drop out of college, and I ended up having to move back in with my father, who I was constantly fighting with now. And eventually, for whatever reason, I had no money. I had nothing. I decided to try a fight because some guy offered that he would pay me $500 to fight, and I needed money. And so I went to a bar, and the guy gave me $500, and I went out there and I knocked the guy out in like 5 seconds. And so it's like he gave me the 500, and I was like, okay, well maybe we could do that again. And I did that again and again and again. I did it 5 times, and then I sort of had this realization that maybe my wrestling career and my background could somehow make it so I could take this seriously and I could become a professional at this. And it was trying to learn how to fight, trying to do the business side that helped me to rebuild the relationships with my father, that helped me to rebuild my family. And it gave me my personal worth back. And then I was able to like deal with all the issues that I hadn't dealt with previously. And then one day, like I wake up and it's like this is my life. Like I'm a professional fighter, you know? Like I didn't plan it. It wasn't this grand plan. My grand plan was to wrestle in the Olympics. My grand plan was to become a doctor. But I just crashed and burned so hard that one day I woke up and I had nothing again. And I didn't like that feeling. And so I had to fix that. I just didn't know how. And then it probably could have been anything. Whatever job I picked, you know, it's just whatever I had focused on, I could use that to pull myself out. And when you go through a depression like that, and when you go through a life like I had, and you have to examine it, you really learn about yourself more than most people do. And in that process of learning about myself, the psychology, you know, like the things that I thought didn't bother me that did, you know, like it was a great learning, and it gave me a base to really expand into fighting and into a business person. And it gave me a lot of skills that I don't think a lot of people have.
Definitely. Yeah. I actually think one of the best things about coming from adversity is the ability to work through it. I think one of the largest it's a gift. It's a gift in disguise because I didn't probably come from the same background as you, but I had a single mom. I walked through metal
Okay.
detectors every day. I was really bullied at school because I was a minority there, so I just looked different.
Yep.
And yeah, it was that whole thing, right? Just which is funny because as I talk to people in this space, so many of us have such a similar story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I think the way that you addressed the other component is something to linger on for people because just like a lot of military people, when you're going through kind of the early stages of your career, you're especially as like Marine officers, you're supposed to be kind of indifferent to everything, right? So you're not supposed to really show much. And the whole idea behind that is to be a good example, but much like you, that leads to excessive compartmentalization and then you not really addressing things. But it sounds like you were able to get to a solid point to start working through some of your background and actually turn those experiences into a strength, which is pretty massive, I have to say. So I have to ask, obviously, a little bit about your career in the UFC. I've always been a hobbyist trainer. I started back when I was in college for similar reasons as you.
Yep.
And I've always enjoyed it a ton. I actually had a chance. I don't know. I'm in San Diego, so we have Victory MMA out here, who has like Dean Lister, who runs their grappling department, which is super cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, so you make this pivot into the UFC. Talk to me about your UFC career, what that's like.
Uh, so we could talk about that for hours, but I'll just condense it into like a small thing. So my first initiation into the UFC is I'm very good at what I do. I'm a very good fighter. I'm very skilled. I train extremely hard. And so the fighting part was never the aspect that I had trouble with. So I did really well. I probably won, I don't remember the exact, but I think I won 5 in a row, which is very rare. And then I had a draw, and then essentially I got fired because I wasn't all that exciting. And when they put the camera in front of my face, I was very nervous. So I had all the fighting skills, but I didn't have the presentation skills that are required to be an entertainer. And so really what held me back in my fight career has very little to do with my talent as a fighter. It was the business side that held me back. And I was able to do quite well. I was ranked in the top 5 in the world, and I had a fight with Chad Mendez. If I would have beat him, it was a very close fight, but if I would have beat him, which I didn't, but that I'm one fight away from a title shot, but that was as far as I got. And so, but I made a long career. I have almost 30 UFC fights. It's a very rare career to have that many fights. And
Mm-hmm.
I did well for myself. But the fighting process involves so much more than just being good at fighting. And when I was younger, I didn't have the skills to interview well. I didn't have the skills because I mean, I come from it's funny to me, and I don't feel bad for myself, but I come from like a batshit insane life. You know what I mean? Like it's like I went through a lot of things. And when someone puts a camera in your face and you're like, well, what do you think about this? It's like, like you don't really want to know what I think about this. You know what I mean? Like I don't. I'm just trying to survive. I got dealt a bad hand, and I'm just trying to survive. And so this is a way for me to make money and try my best and stuff like that. So uh, my entire life, I have been very good at the process. I've been very disciplined. I've been very good at the actual arts. But the business side of life is a little difficult for me. I'm not as personable as some people. I have a hard time with first, like if I have a reason, like here, I have a reason to talk to you. Like I can be quite open. I can be good at an interview. But if we were to just meet outside randomly, I'm terrible at that. You'd be like, that dude's weird. Like if I were just at a bar and like it was like me and my wife and you and your significant other, if you have one, like, and we're just sitting there, you'd be like, that guy's not social at all. You know what I mean? Like he's hard to talk to. So that first impression in the fight game was not good. And that sort of held me back a long time, and it frustrated me. And I actually lost some fights because of the business side frustrated me so much that it affected my training, it affected my stuff like that. But the fighting skills itself, I've always been an exceptionally good fighter, but mixing those two realms was difficult for me until the end when I got much better at it.
It makes a ton of sense. It's one of those things where I guess like when a kid originally finds out that something like wrestling is, or like WWE wrestling, and you realize
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that's kind of like skits, right? And that it's fake and
yeah,
that's super crushing. I found a similar experience when like you realize a big part of fighting is obviously being a fantastic fighter, but you have to be able to sell fights. And
yeah,
I always really respected Mighty Mouse. And I read a lot about his career, and he, I feel like, is another really good example where he was in the UFC and it seemed almost like they were not fully respecting what he had done.
yeah.
And yeah, it's a bummer, right? Because part of it is like you really just want to see who's the just the best, right? Like get rid of
Yeah, I
the
mean, I mean,
divisive
it's a
stuff.
it's
But
it's 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 a bummer in a way, but it's a business, right? You
right,
have to sell the product, and I'm not bitter about it, right? Like at some points, I didn't sell the product, and so
right,
but there were many situations in my fight career where it's like, oh, because a lot of fighting is about matchups. It like the top one guy now might lose to the top 10. You know what I mean? Just because they don't match up well. The top 10 might smash him, but he will never get there. So but and the top one can smash two, three, four, five, six, and make everyone look stupid. But those last four would smash him. So it's a lot about matchups. And it was very difficult for me to find the right matchups at the right time
Mm.
because it's like it was a very dangerous game because they're like, if we put him versus Nick might win, and we don't want that to happen. So I
I see.
constantly had this like stream of really hard fights, but when I would win them, they didn't get me the credit that I needed, And so I'm not complaining because I didn't come equipped to beat a superstar. I just don't have the skills to be a superstar, but I am a very good fighter. So I in some ways I underperformed in that way.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, well, obviously, it's also an incredible perspective that you take on it because it honestly reminds me of trading, where traders, I find in general, they like to find something to blame. The market did this to me. The market maker, who, by the way, doesn't care at all about you, did this to me.
Yeah,
So you obviously have a very just removed perspective of it. It's very objective. You're saying,
yeah.
I'm good at this part I needed to work on. And the fact that you can even reconcile those two like that, to me, would lend really well into something like trading. So as you're going through your UFC career, when did you start trading and how did that come into the picture?
So when I was young, things like investing, saving, these are not things that poor people think about. You know what I mean? So it's like it's not something that was a part of my life. So it's something I knew nothing about. I didn't know anything about the stock market. I didn't even know it existed. And so as I was getting older, and I was never rich, but I was starting to pile up some money and I needed to do something with it, right? And then that was right in the time when after the financial crisis. So the GFC happened right when I got into the UFC. And so like it's like I have a little money, I see everyone else's money evaporating in the market. Like I don't want to put it there, I mean, God, I would be loaded if I just threw it all in,
Yeah,
but
perfect timing.
yeah. But instead it instilled fear in me because I saw so many people losing their money and I seemed to be the only guy with some money. And so then I thought about like, well, I could invest in this and that. But there was one of the things I struggle with in fighting is I'm so obsessive and I train so hard that I overtrain. I overwork. So I always needed some distraction in my life. And so what would fill that distraction sometimes is I would be like competitive in a video game or something, like I'd play StarCraft and I became like very good at StarCraft. Like I became a grandmaster player in StarCraft. And it's like I'm like ranked 100 on this ladder. Like I'm pretty good. But then like one day I was just sitting there, playing StarCraft for like 5, 6 hours straight. And I'm like, what is this getting me? Like it's getting me nothing. Like I mean, it keeps me from training, which is good because I overtrain, I get injured, I get sick. But like I don't want to play this freaking game anymore. You know what I mean? Like I want to do something that matters. And then I just sort of thought, like, what game can I play that could make me money or could be beneficial to my family? And so first I thought poker, blackjack, things like this. And so I tried it and I started like a Poker Stars account and I did really well. I did really well. Like I was pretty good at poker. But then I was like, no, this isn't it. It's just not it. And then I started to think about the stock market. And then I was like, I need to understand this because I knew nothing about the stock market. And so like I literally put out like a study schedule for like a year and I dedicated pretty much 8 hours a day every day for a year to studying stocks, to studying how markets work, to studying bonds. And at first, I was just a complete idiot. You know what I mean? I remember very clearly. I'd read these books, and they would talk about investing, and they're talking about like that you got to have this much of your portfolio in bonds. And I'm trying to do the math, and I'm like, this makes no sense. You can't make 7% here and then have this bond that pays nothing and get to 15%. And I'm like sitting there like screaming at the books, like this makes no sense, not realizing they're just old and they're not in, we're not in the ZERP atmosphere. So it took a while, but after I did that for about a year, I decided to start a trading account. And Thankfully, when I started trading, I did really well. I did really well. And so like I kind of got hooked in it and I started studying more and more and more and more. And it just led to like a lifelong passion of a game I can play that can actually do something valuable in my life.
Yeah, that's absolutely awesome. It's it's reminiscent, I think, for a lot of us, but your angle on it is actually quite unique in the sense of the original intent, which was to find something you could kind of pour some of that obsessive personality into to save some of your other craft that you were working
Yeah.
on at the time. That's very interesting because, like you, and like a lot of traders I know, I also have a highly obsessive personality. Except I was introduced to the market. It's funny when you were talking about like poor people aren't really thinking about investing or trading because I didn't know what it was. And I had
Yeah.
a high school teacher that saw that I was working a lot. And he was just like, "What are you doing with your money?" I was like, "Oh, I'm saving it. Like, that's all I know what to do." And he introduced me to the stock market. He was like, "You should learn about investing. Go to the library." Long story short, that dude changed my life because he introduced me to something I didn't know about early enough that it made a massive impact on the rest of the trajectory of my life. Now, you came into it not so much looking at it directly from the perspective of, I need to make a lot of money doing this. Obviously, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But it sounded like a big part of it also was, I need another way to direct some of this energy away from this other thing I'm highly obsessive about. Which leads me to my follow on question. How did you find symbiosis between the two? Because, at least for me, I become slightly myopic when I'm in like my obsessive modes, and
Yeah.
I can't really function in other things other than that thing I'm obsessed on. But you're doing like two very skilled things simultaneously. How did you find a balance there?
Um, I I don't know how to describe it, but it's like they both filled the same purpose, right?
Okay.
Like it's like when it might sound weird, but the work, the study, and that it calms me down. It doesn't
Okay.
make me stressed. You know what I mean? And as an athlete, it's one of the rare situations. Like my brain can go forever. I have like a very like I can think, I can process things very quickly for a long time. I'm not going to get tired that way. But my body can't compete with that level of thing. So with the fighting, you can only work out hard 3 or 4 hours a day. That's it. That's max. Now I would work work out 2 or 3 times a day, and then like you have a warm up, yeah, then you train hard, then you have a cool down, then you got to diet, you got to go eat. It's a 24-hour job, but that ability to be distracted in a way that's positive. There are lots of ways to get distracted as a fighter, right? Women, drugs, partying, eating, all these things you cannot do because it'll suck the life out of you, right? So I needed to stay engaged, and that's why I would go to the video games. But then that stopped producing the effort, right? Like then it became like boring to me. It wasn't challenging enough. It didn't get me anything. And so the market it just sort of provided that right thing for me. And I I think I don't look at it as a negative, right? But obviously, I dealt with a lot of stuff in my past. So initially, the thought process of staying busy is to stop myself from thinking about that. To like stay ahead of the demons that I'm running from, right? Like I don't feel good about myself when I think about that. So what do? I get obsessed about the work. And I've been able through the years to drop off the bad feelings. I'm not running anymore. I enjoy it. But initially when it started, it was me running from my past. It was me running from the things I don't want to think about. I don't want to feel insecure. I'm good at fighting, so that makes me feel good about myself. I don't want to think about finances because I grew up so poor. I don't want to be scared about losing it. So if I keep winning fights, I don't have to be scared about money. So like there was that's initially how it started, but I've been able to just eliminate the bad parts and keep the good parts as I've gotten older and wiser.
I see. Yeah, and it sounded like you found like a really good balance between both of those crafts, which is really impressive. I think that that's kind of difficult to do. So, walk me through a little bit then of your trading career. What year did you start trading, and what kind of things were you trying in the beginning?
Well, initially, right, I just started investing and stuff, just trading like some index funds and stuff like it, because that's what the books told me to do. But then one day I was just sitting there and I was like, I want to be a trader. You know what I mean? I want to be like a hacker version of a trader. Like those two things always appealed to me, like that kind of like a computer wizard hacker type thing, and like a day
Mhm.
trader. Like those two things like were appealing to me. So like that's what I'm gonna do. And so I studied how to do it, and I mix up the years sometimes, but I believe that where we had the big Christmas Eve crash was 2017 going into 18. I might have that backwards or something, but I believe that's what it was, because we kind of were in a bear market and then we crashed in Christmas Eve, and I bought everything I could. I put my entire net worth in right as January started into the market for trading. And the market did not go down for months. It went straight up. And so it was like, holy crap, like I'm good at this thing. And I'm not good. I just got lucky, right? I'm not good at all. Like I'm terrible. I have no idea what I'm doing. And so then it was stocks. So I started trading stocks and I did quite well. But I wanted to like learn about how the world works. And stocks are terrible. Some people disagree with me on this, but I think stocks are horrible macro assets. They don't respond well to macro events. It's not a macro asset. A bond is a macro asset. A currency is a macro asset. The SOFR curve is a macro asset. These things adjust and they make sense when you understand how the world works. Stocks are in their own world all the time. It's a different type of trading. And so I didn't feel like I had as much of an edge in picking stocks after I picked the good ones. Right? It's like oh I picked some good stocks. What am I going to do? Sell it and buy? There's no other good ones. I got the good ones and I'm doing well. But to really increase the alpha, to increase the chance at higher returns, I needed to go to other markets. And so I dissected and I started learning about what there it doesn't exist anymore, but I started learning about euro dollars. I started learning about uh, the volatility spreads. I started learning about when it turned to SOFR curves, and then I started learning about how to trade bonds. And once I got those things together, I was able to use sort of this puzzle mindset that I have to really piece together a better trading system than just trading stocks. Whereas stocks are very momentum driven, right? They usually go up together, they usually go down together. You can pick the right ones, you can kind of adjust it, but just to trade stocks is a very, very difficult thing to do. It is very difficult to beat S&P if you're just trading stocks, because S&P is essentially built as a trend following system. So if you're not in Nvidia this year, you're screwed, right? I don't own Nvidia, and I'm doing better than SPX this year, right? Because I just am not involved. I just chose not to be involved, and then I don't suffer from the FOMO. I don't suffer from the frustration of missing a stock. I have a lot of ways to bet on the thing, and then when I see value in stocks, I put it in my long term funds. So I love breaking down stocks. I love breaking down finance sheets. I love to find those hidden gems in the stock market. But that's a whole different game, and that's an investing game. And I don't think those two line up as well, at least not for my personality. So that's how I got there.
Yeah, well, it makes a ton of sense. And I think a couple things really stick out. That thing you said actually at the very end there about your personality, I think that's actually a really huge function of creating success in markets, is finding things that do align with your personality, which takes some time. Because I've had a really interesting view of my trading career, because I started back when I was in high school, when I was in 2007. And I've seen, even from all of my documentation on what I do, how much it's evolved as I change and as my disposition as just a man changes. So I think that's a really important point that you shared there about finding things that align with your disposition. So you were talking about a little bit of the evolution of how you tried different things. How did you start realizing that you were finding the thing that you liked, the thing that did align with your disposition?
Well, there's two things, right? One, you make money. If you make money, it seems to make everything feel better, right? So if you're making money, it's hard to be upset about it. And two, um, when I'm in the right trade or I have like a really idea with like a fundamental backdrop and then a technical backdrop, and then I do a lot of quantitative measures, when those three things come together and I put that trade on, I know very well I could lose this trade, but I don't care. You know what I mean? Like I don't care. Like I'm not stressed about it. If it stops me out, it stops me out. I'm not stressed about it. It's the trades where you do care about losing that money that you know you're not really in a good one. You know what I mean? And I was finding a lot of times with stocks, that's how it was. I was good at trading stocks. I was good at trading options on stocks, but I always had just this level of stress that like there that it ate me away and it made my performance worse. And so a lot, and especially with timing stocks, when you're trying to time stocks on like with macro knowledge, you're trying to time stocks like that, it can go very badly. And so I had like a stream where like I had a stream where I made relative to my money. It's not a lot of money relative, but to me, it was a lot of money. I made a lot of money. And then I started to lose it. And I started to pick stocks. And it's like a stock would just go down for no reason. And I'd be like, this makes no sense. And like one time, at one point, I had 10 trades on and the market was up and all 10 of my things were down. I seemed to own the only 10 things in the world that were going down that day. You know what I mean? And in a matter of weeks, I lost so much money, I couldn't believe it. Like, and everything went up except what I owned. And then I realized, like, even if you're great at this, that's going to happen to you. You know what I mean? It's going to happen to you. And so it just, that feeling went away when I felt like I found the right markets. And if I go in a drawdown now, I'm not too worried about it because I feel like I do have an edge and it's quantifiable and I know that it exists. Whereas when I was trading just the stocks itself, the luck wave seemed a lot more present. And so that's how I got into the markets that I feel like good. As far as money goes, I made a lot of money with the stocks, but the feeling just wasn't that good. And I felt like I could lose it. And I went through that short-term stream where I made a ton of money and then I lost, 75% of it in a couple of weeks. It was like, holy crap. Like that's I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I made 25% more money. So I'm still doing pretty good, but like that losing that money hurt so bad that like I was like, I cannot trade like this. And so I had to find a better method. And then once I found the method that I liked, now if I win or lose money, it doesn't affect me as much.
I think the other important point you're talking about there, though, is the process of building something you believe in. And I think a lot of traders that I talk to on that kind of level, it's honestly, it's uncanny listening to you talk and just how many parallels there are. And one of the things that I want to draw out from what you were just talking about is this process of kind of testing ideas and then finding things that you are comfortable with, because markets, no matter what, are going to experience what we would call path. They're path features, and they will go through phases of exactly what you're experiencing. And if you don't have something that you really believe in, it's so easy to say, oh, this doesn't work, I need to switch to something else. And then as soon as you switch, what you were doing before starts working, and what you're doing now goes through a bad path, and you go through this cycle that's pretty brutal. Now, when you're going through and building the things, obviously you're finding your way into the segments of the market, the products that make sense to you. How are you devising what you're doing in those products? I obviously took a look over your X, Twitter, whatever bird or thing I'm supposed to call this platform now. Big Daddy Elon has me super confused. I'm a simple man. But it obviously is very clear that you also like to tinker with different momentum style strategies. I saw one on there using different moving average momentum style trades against the S&P 500. So walk me through this process of how you consider building your approach.
Okay, so initially, anytime I found a market I wanted to know about, I reached out to people that were exceptionally good at it on Twitter. So
Mark.
when I wanted to learn about euro dollars and so forth, I found all the best people at that and I sent them DMs on Twitter and I asked if they would teach me. And thankfully, through this process, and I have a good in because I'm a professional fighter, people were willing to help me. And when they tell me, hey, do these things and then get back to me, and I come back as an expert in everything they told me about, they're like, oh crap, this guy's really serious and he has the mind to do this. And so I've been able to get 4 or 5 mentors that are exceptional. You know what I mean? These guys are world class at what they do. And so I have that advantage that I have great teachers. And so that's number one. You have to find good mentors in life. You have to find them. And if you don't, it's going to be more difficult for you. Then the approach, like you said, I do a mixture of quantitative analysis and like you said, trend following, right? So a lot of it is price based. I have a lot of quantitative models that track a variety of spreads. So like asset spreads versus each other, stock spreads versus each other. If on very simple terms, you could use something like ES versus small caps, right? And you can chart that. You can see which ones are outperforming. Well, I do that on a very more complex level, but I use that as to create the backdrop. And I have like a quantitative scoring system that tells me which assets should be outperforming during certain times. And then I only trade those assets if I have backup. So I use seasonality. I use, like I said, price action. I use trend following. And if the quantitative and the technicals mix, now I will trade that asset for that period of time. And now I'm looking in a shorter time frame to trade those markets. And so that's really how I've been able to build that process, right? So I have the quantitative part, which is much more complex than anything I could look at personally. I can get the computer to do it. And then I have the technical analysis aspect, more of like a trend following system that I built. It uses a lot of different things, moving averages, fractal measurements of time, and stuff like that. But in its most basic sense, it's a trend following. So when everything aligns together, then I will trade that asset and I feel like the wind is at my back. And so if I have a macro reason then to enter the trade, so that's the most discretionary idea. Like, oh, I think this currency go up because of an election, right? Maybe you might be right, right? But if I have the other backdrops, I have it at my back, and then I'm able to actually come up with trade things. And when I come up with a trade idea, if it has the quantitative measurements behind me, then I take the trade. And so that's sort of like how my system works.
Got it. Yeah, I kind of refer to that general ideas. I call it stacking strength, which is exactly you're kind of referring to it as like the wind at your back. I think that that's such a great point. Are you trading? It looks like from your, again, Flying Bird page X, it looks like mostly futures. Is that primarily the products you're trading?
Yeah, I trade futures and then I trade the options on either, the ETF equivalent, like so there if the option market is liquid, in the ETF equivalent, depending on which one I feel is the better. So with the futures, it's like obviously you're leveraged. So if if
Mhm.
I if I if I plan on holding something longer, I might look for an ETF alternative. That way I'm not fearing, like that I'm gonna get blasted out for some being over leveraged. But in general, I trade the futures. I like the futures products. I started with options. I used to think that was better because it's easier to just, if you want to bet $500 on an option, you don't need to stop, right? You bet the 500 and then you're good. It either works or it doesn't. Whereas with futures, you have to be very technical. You have to pick the stop. You have to pick when you're wrong. You're going to be wrong more often. But when you get better at trading futures, it's like you have more control, I feel like, over the ending process, and you don't have the drag of optionality of theta and all that other kind of stuff. So I really like the futures markets, and I pretty much just trade those and I spread trade them against each other.
Yeah, I figured I picked up that was actually going to be the follow-on question is for the pairs trading, but yeah, I could kind of tell based on what you're saying that you're using spreads. And yeah, I think the other beautiful part about futures is really it simplifies things, right? It's a Delta One product. It still has an
Yeah.
expiration. You're still going to deal with contango, so there still will be drag holding super long term, but it does simplify a lot of what's going on as compared to options. I'm primarily a derivatives trader, so I trade
Yeah.
options and futures. I've done that essentially my entire career, but futures, there's a specific beauty to them
Yeah.
in that. Plus, I mean, a lot of them are tax advantaged, which is also pretty sick. You get section
Yeah.
1256, so 60/40 long-term,
Yeah.
short-term capital gains tax, which is pretty dope. You were talking about though about the periods of your trading. So you are spread trading, which makes a lot of sense, especially using futures. What are the typical time frames that you're looking at for your positions?
So it's either I trade two time frames essentially, right? I trade 1 to 3 weeks essentially, and I trade 3 months to 6 months essentially. So those are like the two time frames that I like. The middle ground I'm not so good at, 45 days, stuff like that. I feel I have a very hard time with that. So if I can push it out 6 months, I'm pretty good. Because sometimes I'm early. Like I'm always like I have good ideas, but I can be early. And then on the shorter time frames, if I'm going to use options, if I'm going to do like if I'm going to trade an option, I'm looking at 30 days, 30 to 40 days out. And then but I'm looking for it to pop within a week or two. You know what I mean? Like and then get out. And so that's really the time frame. Sort of that 5 days, if it happens in three, great. But sort of that 5 to 10 trading days is the short term. Maybe that can change to 15 if I'm going to roll or I'm going to have some futures or something. And then I cut it off completely until we get over 3 months after that.
Got it. And I mean, even that makes a ton of sense just in terms of assessing correlations once you get into those middle grounds, which obviously from your research, you already know this, but for everybody else listening, almost perfectly with the timeframes that you've selected, those midterm periods, the correlations can behave very strange in there for various products. So you're kind of trading more persistent correlation and then short term, which is, yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Now, when you're looking at the way you manage your book, do you have a preference for the shorter term or kind of like your longer range timeframes? Like how do you split what you're doing between those two buckets?
I just have separate accounts for it. So it's like,
Okay.
and I do the measurements every day, and whatever is hitting at the time, I go for it. So, the markets they seem to go in patterns, right? Sometimes people are thinking longer term. Sometimes they're very hypersensitive. In the high vol times, I'm going to be obviously on a shorter time frame. I don't need as much length to get the juice that's required to make money. And so I'm going to be shorter time frame. And then the longer, really, it just has to do with the trade selection and the product. You know what I mean? Like let's say I want to short USD JPY right now, right? Because I think intervention risk is high. I think seasonality is in the right time frame. Like I have a very small starter position in that short JPY, right? Like the idea that I'm going to be able to time that to a week basis while everyone has been getting stopped out for years at this point, trying to do this trade, right? Like the idea that I'm going to just walk in and nail it within 5 days,
Top
probably
ticket.
probably impossible, right? I'm going to be there when the number one carry trade in the world blows up in the week it happens, minimal chance, right? So I'm going to have to extend that trade. I like the trade, but I gave I have one position that expires in August, and then I have another one that's going to go, as we go into like, kind of November type range is what I'm thinking about, right? So it's like the August one, it's like I'm hoping they intervene, but it's a small position, and if they don't, and if it doesn't crash, well, then I'll lose, and it's fine. It's a small amount of money. It makes sense as far as the risk reward, and I'm
Right.
willing to take it. But really, the trade itself is what decides the length, right? And so whatever I'm looking at, I just if it fits in one of those two time frames, I take it. I don't have a preference as to one or the other. The only thing I have a preference for is if I'm going to buy a stock like I want that to be years that I'm going to hold it. Like if I'm going to go for individual stocks, I want it needs to have, the PE needs to be right, the cash flow needs to be right. I need to have some kind of reason to own this thing. I'm not trying to trade it because I don't have an edge in that market. And so like I'm really looking to invest in that, and that's going to go into a long-term account. That's going to go in my child's college fund. That's going to go in that thing. And I actually am very good at those things, but those trades don't come along that often. And so like if every day you're looking for those trades, you're going to overtrade. And so the macro products give me the ability to like really be in the markets every day.
Yeah. Yeah, and to your point, there's a lot of movement in them as well in terms of the relationships and kind of what's hitting, what's not. So that makes a lot of sense. When you look at, let's say last year's kind of well, maybe 2 years ago would be a better example. When you look at the performance of your approach and you kind of compare it over like 2022 and 2023, when
Okay.
you think about your general approach, how does it fare in those two different markets? And for everybody listening, the reason why I'm asking those 2 years specifically is 22, it was almost a bear market. I guess technically it hit trowel, but the market landed down like 19 and a half ish. And then 23, it was up almost 24. So what I'm curious about is if you are completely non-correlated to S&Ps, or if you have kind of a lead lag relationship with them depending on how S&Ps perform.
Okay, so I hope I don't get lost in kind of explaining my thought process here, but in general, my goal is to be uncorrelated to S&P 500, right? I have an allocation to S&P stocks, but I want to be uncorrelated. And you can like them or dislike them or think he made it or not, but there's that Ray Dalio type sense that the holy grail of trading is to have essentially 10 to 15 uncorrelated asset streams. And then pretty much if you can do that, that's the trick to investing, because they're not related. It's very difficult to do that. It's almost impossible. I mean, maybe Renaissance has done it, but that's about it. And when it comes to like, that's the goal. The goal is to have uncorrelated asset streams that you can trade that are not related to each other, and then you can look for the proper trades because one's not going to screw the other one. And so that's always what I'm looking for. I'm looking for uncorrelated assets. Now, do I find that many? No, it's very difficult, and they change all the time. You know what I mean? You can have a certain asset relationship that's worked for years and it just falls apart. The most basic one is the stock bond comparison, right? That has totally shifted from what it used to be. Now they're correlated, right? If you look at gold and tips, they're 70% correlated right now. That makes zero sense. There's no reason that real yields in gold should be, performing at the same thing. It doesn't make any sense, right? You have one that's a negative yielding asset. You have one that's paying you to own it. Those things should not be the same price, but they are. So you can either fade that or go with it. But I'm looking for those asset streams to put into a model that can tell me when's a good time to own it and when not. And then I can figure out trades with that idea. So the entire idea of everything I do is to find uncorrelated asset streams. It's just an incredibly difficult process to do. And so have I succeeded? Yeah, I have succeeded, but I'm certainly far from mastering the art.
Sure. And to your point, it's something that kind of continually shifts anyway. So I think the way that you talk about it really, it sums it up really well, because I also like to pairs trade. It's kind of a slower, I use it almost as like a smoothing function of portfolio returns. And sometimes it's not so smoothing because of that exact thing, because
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
have things that get blown out that I just don't expect to. And it's just kind of like, okay, sick. Love that for me.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I, I know that we're coming up on time here, but I have a couple last questions for you. One of them is, when you look across your evolution as a trader from where you started to kind of where you're at now, The very first question I want to ask with respect to that is, where do you want to go next? Where do you think your next stage of evolution is?
So the goal is going to sound rather ridiculous, but this is always how I've thought about things. When I started wrestling, I started very late. It's very rare for someone in Minnesota to start wrestling in high school. It's almost unheard of, and especially for them to do good. But when I walked in the wrestling room for high school, I remember very clearly telling those guys, I said, I will be the best wrestler in Minnesota. And they laughed at me like you know what I mean? They totally laughed me out of the room. And I went into, and then I proceeded to get my ass kicked by everyone in that room that day. Right? So they could prove the point that I don't belong there. Well, when I finished, I was the best wrestler in Minnesota. I was. And when I started fighting, they said, you can't drop out of school and start fighting and make a career out of this. Well, I did very well. Right. And with trading, in investing, I feel like it's the same thing. And so in 10 years, I think I will be one of the best at this. I will be up there. I will understand markets on a level that very few people do. I feel like I will be successful. I don't know where that path will take me. Will it take me into an analyst path? Will it take me into a hedge fund path? Will I just be trading my own money? I have no idea. But every year I have exponentially gotten better. I have gotten much better. And so the end goal is to be one of the best. I plan on being one of the best. I have the capability of doing it. I have the support structure. I have the backdrop to do it. It's just, can I do it? Can I fail? I've failed plenty of times in my life. The failure is a real option. And in fighting, as I learned, just being a good fighter wasn't enough, right? A lot of the time. So the business side could be more difficult than I'm expecting, but I really do feel like in 10 years, I will be one of the better traders in the world.
When you think about the idea of being a better trader, what does that mean to you? Is that the highest percent returns? Is that the best risk
Yes,
adjusted returns?
I, I have many theories on this. You could talk about this stuff all day. Like what is alpha? What like are you just doing leverage beta? Is it actually alpha? Are you if you make 100%, like are the risk adjusted returns like are they? And at the end of the day, I think trading is about making money, and money is the scoreboard. And so
Got it.
if I can have an exceptional life, and obviously everything I do is to reduce risk, right? I don't want the risk, and it drags on the portfolio returns. Obviously, if you have less risk, you're going to make less money. But I don't want to blow up either. I have children. I have a family, right? So what makes it the best? It's an unquantifiable thing, right? For me, what will make me the best is I can come in here every day and I can take care of my family off of it. We can have an exceptionally good life. And I don't have to worry about money. If we want to go to a fancy restaurant, we can do it. If I want to do this, I can do it. If I want to do the things that are required of life, I can do it. And so if I'm able to turn the amount of money I have in now into that, I will be an exceptionally good trader. So I mean, that will be the scoreboard. Well, do I want to go down in history as other people knowing that I'm one of the best traders? I could care less. I could care less if a person has no idea who I am for the rest of my life. I did that. I was in that realm. And if I could fight in people's basements and rich people would pay me to fight in pits like in Best of the Best or something, I would have done that over anything, right? The fame or press of trading doesn't appeal to me. The idea that I can take me and the background I come from, and I can sit in front of a computer and I can make money, that's very appealing to me. And I feel like the knowledge and the wisdom that I will acquire in that 10-year period will be noticeable, and I will be able to judge myself based on where I am in that scale.
Yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense. And the reason why I asked that question is because you hit on an important point. I actually argue more often than not that like what quantifies success as a trader really is defined by the trader. I really do believe that. And it's because there are different objectives and different ways to approach the game to hit those different objectives. And one of my primary goals, I had like very specific timelines and targets for things because I knew that I was going to be my mom's retirement. So by the time I was in my late 20s, I needed to be at a spot where I knew I could start taking care of her. And that was a big part of my trajectory. So you defining it for yourself, I honestly think is literally the pristine answer. The second question I had for you to wrap up with is, looking back over your entire learning process so far, if you were to give yourself a piece of advice starting over again, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Um, the time frame the time frame of what is possible in the short term is much smaller than you give it credit for. So you come in with dreams of making so much money. You come in with dreams of making, like, I'm going to make 10% a month or something, and you never really think about the idea that like you would own all the money in the world if you could just do that.
Yeah.
You'd be the rich, like if you could just compound 10% every fucking week. It's not realistic, right? So on the shorter time frame, relax. But on the larger time frame, where we're talking years, you don't understand what's possible if you just keep the momentum going. And so at the beginning of my thing, my career was like this, and then it 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 was like this, and it was like this. And then all of a sudden, like, you're a couple years in, and you realize that it just kind of looked like this. You know what I mean? It kind of just went like this, right? And if you would have just did that, you would have had a much easier life and things would have been better, right? And so in the grand scale of life, that compounding, if you do the right things, it feels like a long time, but one day, 2 years, 5 years from now, you wake up, and if you did it all right, you have a shit ton of money, and you have a shit ton of freedom, and everything just comes together. So I would tell myself, relax on the shorter time frame. Don't be so stressed about making money now, but don't underestimate what's possible, because great things are possible if you do the right path. And so just keep on that trajectory.
I love that. I literally love that so much. I think that's one of the things actually on my website that I try to build a visual for people to see that exact thing you're talking about. The capacity of compounding returns and what that actually looks like as compared to highly volatile but very peaky returns. So, I mean, what a great message. I gotta say, man, like, I absolutely love chatting with you. I love your disposition towards the world. You have obviously a huge amount of experience to share with people. So, first, from me and my community, thank you so much for coming to hang out for a while with us. Now, I'll obviously throw a link to your X page in the video description. Is there anywhere else that you want to share with people if they want to get a hold of you?
Nope, that's it.
Perfect. Well, I definitely would love to keep in touch, see how things are going for you. And yeah, man, it's so cool to hear your background added to kind of the archives I have of all these different trader archetypes, how they find their ways into markets. It makes it one of the coolest places to be. So thank you for being a part of the community, and thanks for hanging out, man.
Yeah. Much respect. God bless you guys.
Awesome, brother.